Okay, Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8. Verse 1. In those days the multitude being very great, having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. Now, does that sound familiar? That sounds like Mark chapter 6. Another incident where there's a multitude of people that have come there to listen to Jesus, to benefit from his miracles, and now a need has arose. They've been with Jesus for 3 days. The food supply has run out. And Jesus cares about their needs. He cares about what will happen to them. If I send them away hungry to their houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. Jesus was very concerned about the physical well-being of people. And he wanted them to be adequately fed and adequately taken care of. Verse 4, then his disciples answered, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. Now, it seems as though they have forgotten about what had happened in Mark chapter 6, where he fed the 5,000. Now, some have suggested that they either forgot it or that they did not realize Jesus would be willing to do this again, to perform a miracle on this quantity once again. And so they are not even asking him to perform the miracle like he did in Mark chapter 6. So they have 7 loaves of bread. Verse 6. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and they set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. So the 7 loaves fed a multitude with 7 baskets left over. This is the word for a large basket. It's actually the Greek word for the word in Acts chapter 9, where Saul was let down in a basket. Was that, I think, at Damascus? He was leaving. The persecution was starting against Saul, and he was let down in a basket. So these were big baskets that would be big enough for a person to get in, like Saul did in Acts chapter 9. 7 of them, large baskets of leftover fragments. Verse 9, now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Immediately, verse 10, he got into a boat and his disciples and came to the region of Dalmathua. Here we have Jesus supplying food for 4,000 people. He's supplied food for 5,000 in Mark chapter 6, and now he's supplying food for 4,000. So here we have Jesus making provision, making miraculous provision for 4,000 people in this situation. There was a need that needed to be taken care of. And Christ was going to meet that need and take care of their situation. And so I'm reminded of verses like you find in Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus said, consider the lilies of the field, consider the birds of the air. God takes care of them. You seek first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and all of these things, what you shall eat, what you shall drink, what you shall wear, will be taken care of. All these other things shall be added unto you if you seek first the kingdom. Now, I'm not suggesting that Jesus is going to miraculously multiply our food. Not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that Jesus provided for them. on this occasion, because he was on earth and was performing miracles, he did multiply the loaves and the fishes to provide for the multitude. But if we're following Jesus and seeking after Jesus, I think the point that's being made is Jesus will take care of us. Those needs will be met. And so we don't have to be concerned and worry and be anxious about things. God will take care of the situation. He will provide for us. And so we see Jesus here taking care of the multitude as they were in need. And notice it doesn't matter how big the multitude was, 5,000 plus, 4,000. There was so much so provided that there was leftovers. 7 big baskets, large baskets of leftover fragments. And they gathered up those fragments. Notice there's no waste. No wasting of food. I have to admit that I am bad about wasting food. And I ask God to forgive me for doing that. It's a shame. There are people in the world that would love to have what we throw away because of the terrible poverty that they live in. And I hate to do it, and I do it, and I'm trying to do better. But I see here a stewardship lesson as well. You take up what's left over. You don't waste. This is a blessing from God. You don't waste it. So you take it up and you use it later on. Any question or comment or observation about Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10? Exactly. What did David say in Psalm 23? My cup overflows. You provide a table for me in the presence of my enemies. My cup overflows. What did Jesus say in John 10? I came to give them life and to give it more abundant. I believe that's John 10, verse 10. The thief does not come except to steal, to kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and that they might have it more abundantly. That word abundantly means more than you can handle. Your blessings will overflow. Your cup will overflow. And notice these who were there, they were there to listen to Jesus. They were there to benefit from Him. And then He provided for their need. As I stated before when we were looking at Mark chapter 6, Jesus didn't create a bunch of food, say, hey, come out and for the free meal, and then He started teaching them. That's not how it worked. They were out because of Jesus. Then a need arose. Then Jesus provided for them physically. And I don't think we should bribe people with any free giveaway or anything like that as far as gimmicks are concerned. We should be preaching the message. The attracting power of God is the gospel. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. Mark chapter 8 verses 11 and 12, the Pharisees seek a sign. Now this is interesting because Jesus had already been performing signs and wonders all openly in front of them. But this wasn't satisfactory. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with Him, seeking from Him a sign from heaven, testing Him. But He sighed deeply in His spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. Now, in Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 16, it goes into it more deeply. He calls them a hypocrite. He said, you can look at the weather and discern what's going on with the weather by looking at the sky, but you cannot discern the times. And in Mark 16 and verse 4, he says, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. He said, a wicked and perverse generation seeks after a sign. So all the miracles that Jesus had been doing openly, that they were witnessing, that they saw, in fact, they even tried to trap him with his miracles because he healed on the Sabbath and tried to use that against him. That was not enough for them. They needed to see something else. We need to see something else. We need a sign from heaven, from you, to verify in our minds you are the Messiah. And Jesus said, that's wicked and perverse. And that the only sign you would be receiving is the sign of Jonah. And that refers to the fact that Jonah was in the belly of the great fish 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights, figuratively speaking, not full 24-hour periods, but part of a day referring to a whole. The point is that the only sign you're going to have is me. You're going to kill me. I am going to resurrect from the tomb that you put guards outside to guard, and then I'm going to ascend back to the Father. And it's very interesting that when he mentions Jonah there in Matthew 16, when he mentions Jonah, this is the only prophet that Jesus ever compared himself to, Jonah. And Jonah was a disobedient prophet for the most part. And it's very interesting. He says, I am going to be like Jonah to this generation. And so you see that sign was given, which was the sign of Jonah. Verses 13 through 21 of Mark chapter 8, Jesus is going to give further teaching concerning the analogy or the concept of leaven or bread. And the disciples are not going to understand it at first. Verse 13, he left them, getting into a boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. So they've gotten out in the boat, and they only have 1 loaf of bread. And he charged them, saying, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, Is it because we have no bread? But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said to him, 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. So he said to them, how is it that you do not understand? Now, Jesus is trying to use an illustration here of leaven. They're thinking of physical bread. And Jesus is reminding them, don't you remember when I fed the 5,000 and the 4,000? Don't you think Jesus would have no problem feeding 12? 12 in a boat? There would be no problem. No issue at all for him if he could feed 5,000 plus on one occasion, then another occasion he could feed 4,000. 12 on a boat would not be a problem for him. But they're missing the point of what he's saying. He says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now you go back to Matthew chapter 16. Verse 11, again, this is parallel to this. How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Then they understood, verse 12, that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Beware of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now in chapter 8 and verse 15 of Mark, he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. That may indicate that Herod was part of the Sadducees as far as his doctrine and his religious belief is concerned. The point is, he's giving the illustration of leaven. Now, what does leaven do? I mean, what is leaven? It's what? It's yeast. What does it do in bread? Makes it rise. So it permeates the dough and causes it to rise. That's why your bread, rises up in the baking process. Leaven, oftentimes symbolically, in the Bible, represents sin, represents evil, represents a bad influence. I think there's only one exception of that in the Bible where Jesus gives the parable in which leaven is used to denote something positive. The kingdom is like leaven, in which it permeates society. And that might be the only exception. During the Passover, they were not to have anything leavened in the house when they partook of it, when they partook of the Passover feast. Any leavened products were to be taken out of the house completely. When Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, he took unleavened bread. That was part of the Passover. Well, that represented his sinless body. Symbolic of his sinless body. The fruit of the vine, which is not wine in the alcoholic sense, because that would have been a product of leaven, a product of yeast. So it was grape juice, fruit of the vine. And therefore that represented his sinless blood. And that's what we partake of in the Lord's Supper. That's what he instituted. Here, Jesus is talking about the Pharisees, a religious group. Herod here, which could be referred to as the Herodians, a political religious type group. Also the Sadducees. He says, beware of their leaven. Now, why would false teaching of a particular religious group be likened unto leaven?
Like bread, and what we face with today, it really makes it look more puffed up than what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It really falsifies it as something grand.
Exactly. It permeates the dough, and it comes in a way that is secret. It comes in a way that is private sometimes. When you look at the book of Jude, maybe I'm looking at the wrong one. Maybe it's 2 Peter 2. Yeah, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1. 2 Peter 2 and verse 1. But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed. Secretly. It's not something you can just sit there it's happening. It's not bubbling forth, in some sort of eye-catching way. It's secretly at work in the lump, permeating the dough. And so that secret heresy, the teaching. So he's saying you've got to beware of these religious groups, and you've got to beware of them because of the secret nature in which they come in. 2 Peter chapter 2 says it's secret, and Jude talks about them coming in secretly. That's why I was thinking that verse was in Jude. And usually it's around an individual who wants a following. They want a following, and therefore, what does Paul say to the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20, verse 29? They will secretly draw away disciples after them. There's going to be that kind of activity that goes on. So that is the leaven aspect of it, and you've got to purge it out, because if you don't, a little leaven will leaven the whole lump. That goes along with the whole concept of sin not purged out of a congregation will cause problems. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 talks about that. As he talks about a church that's not performing church discipline, he says you have to. He says there in verse 7, 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. For indeed Christ is our Passover, who was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity of truth. So he's talking here about the problem of the leaven spreading. Verse 6, your glorying is not good. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? So it has to be dealt with, whether it's immoral living, as you have in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, or it's false teaching. It has to be dealt with. Of course, you deal with it in love, with long suffering, but you cannot let it be taught and permeate your thinking. And there are so many people today that have such a denominational concept of things. Their minds have been just permeated with the leaven of denominationalism. And their thinking has been corrupted. And he's saying you've got to be aware of that. You've got to be on guard of that. And make sure that doesn't happen. Well, what are some ways that we can be on guard? And how can a congregation be protected from the leaven of false religion? Know the Word. Every member should be a student of the Word and be very familiar with the truth. What else? Live it every day. Exactly. Making sure whoever's preaching or teaching is doing it from the Scriptures accurately. 1 John 4:1, Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, test the spirits, to see whether they be of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. What responsibilities do elders have in that? Think about the shepherding aspect. Does a shepherd who takes care of sheep, does he not know what to look for if he sees some sort of disease on the sheep? He sees a disease or some sort of infection. He can't just ignore that, because that sheep can give it to the rest of the flock. He might have to take that sheep aside and give that sheep some medicine, something to help the situation. He's got to be aware of what a healthy sheep looks like, a healthy flock. Because if he lets disease just enter into the flock, those elders, those shepherds aren't doing their job. So they got to be aware of what's going on. They got to be aware of what sound doctrine is, what proper teaching is. And they've got to guard the church against it, protect the flock.
And I think they have to have a good understanding of the word little, too. Because a lot of times things are overlooked. They don't think it's that big a deal.
Right.
The problem is, just like the scripture's talking about, it only takes just a little bit to start. And then it grows.
Exactly.
Just like bread.
I've never baked bread, but don't you just put in a little bit of yeast? Just a little bit. You just eat it. I just eat it too. But you just put a little bit in, and it permeates the whole lump. Right. Exactly. I mean, you put it just a little bit in there, and it can do so much. And so when teachings are being done that are contrary to the will of God, it can do so much damage. Just a few weeks ago, a preacher friend of mine told me a prime example of something like that happening. There was a preacher preaching this blatantly false teaching about the second coming of Christ. I mean, it was false. And this teacher was teaching this in a large congregation, in a classroom, for years, and the elders didn't know what was going on. And it caused division. And he got him a following to follow him, and he split the church. That teaching was going on in that classroom for years, and the elders were unaware of it. Those were shepherds who weren't doing their job. They need to be aware of what's going on in the classrooms. And they're not watching out for the flock. And, Ezekiel 34 talks about woe unto those shepherds who do not tend to the flock. Woe unto them. They're going to have to answer. Because a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26, you have a blind man that is healed at Bethsaida. Then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the town, and then he spat on his eyes and put his hands on him, and he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and he said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up, and he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. Very interesting healing going on here. He took the blind man out of the town, and he spit in his eyes, put his hands on him, then asked, what do you see? What we see going on here is Jesus not healing him instantaneously, but in basically two stages. And really, this is medically correct. Because this man who is blind, his eyes were healed, his vision was restored, but his brain couldn't process the images. And therefore he healed him, laid hands on him and healed him again, and he was restored and saw everyone clearly. It's not that Jesus healed him and, it didn't work, I need to do it again. That's not what's going on here. This man is being healed, and when this man was healed, his eyes were healed first, and then he healed the mechanism within his brain that interprets sight. That's why when he could see with his eyes, he could see men like trees walking. He was seeing images, but he couldn't process what was going on. He couldn't process the images. And then he healed the brain part, the visual part of his brain. Why Jesus did this in this manner, I do not know. And I've not come across anyone that really knows. But it just shows God's control over things. He could have done it instantaneously, but he did this in stages. Now, we benefit from this because we know that seeing is more than having your eyes be able to take in light. You got to be able to process those images. Think about a man who's born blind. He's never seen at all before. His eyes are instantly healed. Is he going to know what's going on? He's not going to know what's going on. The images aren't going to be able to be processed in his mind because he don't know what a rainbow looks like. He doesn't know what a tree looks like. He's heard descriptions of them. But then his mind has to be trained to understand, oh, this is a person, this is a tree, this is... But Jesus healed the man's eyes, then healed the man's mechanism within his brain. What is it called? The visual cortex? Is that the fancy word for the brain? The visual cortex? To be able to perceive what he's seeing and understand what he's seeing. So, for whatever reason, Jesus did this, but it's very interesting because it shows really his complete control over everything, and him healing him in stages instead of all at once. He told him in verse 26, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. He would tell that to Jewish individuals because there would be multitudes that would come out from the Jewish people if they heard about this man being healed, and Jesus wouldn't have the mobility to get around. We've already seen that earlier in the book of Mark. So he's telling this man, a Jewish individual, not to tell people about this. But when he would heal a Gentile, he'd say, you go tell others about it. He wasn't going to spend time in the Gentile areas. Verses 27 through 30 of Mark chapter 8, you have Peter making the great confession, which is basically a summary of what you find in Matthew chapter 16. Now Jesus and his disciples went out of the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, who do men say that I am? So they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. In Matthew's account, Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to him, you are the Christ. Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. Again, it wasn't the time for this to be widely spread. There would come a time when Jesus would say, go into all the world and preach the gospel. But not now. Not at this point. Now, going back over this and looking at this from Matthew's standpoint, who was saying that Jesus was John the Baptist? Who was saying that? Was it Peter? Was Peter saying that? Herod. Herod was the one who said that. Remember, he imprisoned John. Mark chapter 6. He says this Jesus is John risen from the dead. And he said that out of a guilty conscience because he had John arrested, had him beheaded because of Herodias. And so he thought Jesus was John risen from the dead. So you have him making that claim. Others were saying Elijah. Now, why would some say Elijah? Why would Jesus be referred to as Elijah? What book of the Old Testament said Elijah was coming before the Messiah came? How about Malachi 4? Malachi 4, the very last chapter, the very last writings of the Old Testament. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb, with the statutes and judgments. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, who will be coming, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And you read Matthew 17, 10 through 13, Jesus explains that John the Baptist is Elijah. Not literally, but figuratively. John came in the spirit and the manner of Elijah. He was in the wilderness. He wore camel's hair. He ate locusts and wild honey. He was a woodsman. That's how Elijah was as a prophet. And John was very much like that. But the preaching of Elijah was what? Repent. The preaching of John was what? Repent. The preaching of Jesus was what? Repent. So there's some similarities there, and so people say, well, this is Elijah. Or one of the other prophets. Jesus preached like the Old Testament prophets. In fact, he was the culmination of all of the prophets as the Son of God. But then Jesus focused his attention on his disciples. Who do you say that I am? Peter said, you are the Christ. In Matthew's account, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And there is where Jesus makes the promise to build his church. Matthew 16 and verse 18. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. In Mark's account, it's just a short and condensed version of what you find in Matthew. And so here you have the great confession. They're coming to terms with all of the miracles that they're seeing. They're coming to terms with the realization, this is the Messiah. This is the Christ. Remember what they would ask when he would still the storm in the boat. Who is this? That even the winds and the sea obey him. Who is this man? Well, the only conclusion that they can come to that's correct is that he is the Christ. He's the Messiah, the Son of God. And there are many people today who have various interpretations of who Jesus is. You have the Islamic religion who says that Jesus was just a great prophet, just a human. That's all he was. You have Jehovah's Witnesses who say he's Michael the Archangel. When he became human, he was nothing but a human. You have others who say he was just a good man, a philosopher. Still others say, well, he didn't even exist at all. He's just a myth. So you have all these various interpretations of who Jesus of Nazareth is, and there's only one correct one. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is the only one that makes sense. That's the only one that fits with the prophecies of the Old Testament. And so there is no reason to think of Jesus in any other terms except what the Bible says. Beginning in verse 31, we just have a few more minutes for this. Verse 31 through 33, Jesus is setting his face towards Jerusalem. And he is going to start to tell them that he's going to go there to die. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke these words openly, but then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter so bold. Peter so impulsive. He spoke up correctly. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and now he's rebuking him. He's rebuking Jesus. Verse 33. But when he had turned around, he looked at his disciples, and he rebuked Peter, saying, Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. Now, why was Peter rebuking Jesus? scared of be part of it. Why is he rebuking? Jesus hadn't said anything wrong. Why is Peter rebuking Christ?
Their faith is still, I mean, just if you're when he's saying, who do you say that I am? And they spoke on record that you are the Christ, Peter did, but their faith is still young at this point.
Mm-hmm.
They just got to be reminded, in chapter 8, that Christ had said, 5,000 dead, 4,000, he's going to take care of them. My message right now is they're still young.
That's a good explanation. They are still young in their faith. But what would drive Peter to rebuke the Lord and say no? Other accounts say he says no, you're not going to. That can't happen. You can't go to Jerusalem and die. Why would he say that? Is it not because he misunderstood the mission of the Christ? He believed Jesus was the Christ, but what did they think the Christ was going to do? Pull out the sword and put a hurt on the Romans. Drive them out of Jerusalem. That was what the Christ was supposed to do. The Messiah in their minds. That's what they've been taught all their lives. That's what the rabbis were saying. The Christ is going to set up an earthly kingdom on earth. He's going to ride in Jerusalem on a white horse. He's going to conquer the enemies, destroy the enemies, and Israel is going to be exalted over the nations as the world power. And all other nations will be subservient to Israel. But what did Jesus say? My kingdom is not of this world. What did Jesus say? Love your enemies. Someone slaps you, you show them the other cheek. What? That's not what we have been taught. See? They've been taught something all their life, and here Jesus comes on the scene. You are the Christ, but you're not the Christ we thought you were going to be. And that's why, for the most part, later on in Jerusalem, they welcomed him when he came in. His triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Hosanna to the Son of David. And they're sitting there waiting. What's he going to do? He overturns the tables in the temple. Okay, here it comes. There's no earthly empire set up. Crucify him. He's not the Messiah. He can't be. Because the Messiah is supposed to come and physically fight the Romans and set up a kingdom. This can't be the Messiah in their minds. You see how misunderstanding the Scriptures is so detrimental. It's what put Jesus on the cross. They misunderstood all of those Old Testament passages about the coming of the Christ and the kingdom. And so when Christ came saying the kingdom is at hand, they said, no, this isn't what we were hoping for. So that's why Peter is rebuking him. You can't go to Jerusalem and do this. I just confessed you're the Christ. You can't go to Jerusalem and die. You see, in their minds, that's incompatible. The Messiah is not supposed to die. The Messiah is supposed to reign on a literal throne. They still don't understand. Even to the point of Acts chapter 1, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They didn't get it even then. It's not for you to know the times or the seasons that the Lord has put in motion, but you shall receive power, he says. That's why the Holy Spirit had to come upon them and speak through them the gospel message, because they didn't even have it figured out just a few days before Pentecost. They still thought Jesus was going to set up an earthly empire. It's hard to unteach a lifetime of false doctrine. takes a while, even for the perfect preacher, Christ. It's hard to unteach that false doctrine. So, we'll look at verses 34 through 38 in our devotional time. By the way, it's very interesting, verse 33, and we'll end with this. He called Peter Satan. Get behind me, Satan. Peter didn't know it, but he was working for Satan at this point. He didn't think he was, but he was, because Satan was trying to overthrow the purposes of God. Get behind me, Satan. Satan means adversary. You're not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. We'll look at verses 34 through 38 in our devotional time.